Welcome everyone to Jana's first virtual lunchtime tea discussion. My name is Rachel Littman. I'm the Executive Director of the Yale Alumni Nonprofit Alliance. I also want to say thank you to First Gen Yale and to Yale Women for co-sponsoring this event, and to the Yale Alumni Association for helping us promote it. Just for those who aren't familiar with this, the Jana tea format is kind of like a fireside chat. Ours are modeled off the teas hosted at Yale undergraduate campus at the homes of each of the head of the residential colleges, which is the residential housing and community system at Yale. And these tea gatherings are literal teas, and they often feature a famous Yale alum who speaks about his or her career and then stays to chat with students in an intimate setting. Our teas at Jana are a little bit more focused, and they are designed to highlight Yale alumni involved in advancing positive social change. So we have with us today Dr. Ivy Taylor, Davenport class of 1992, and she's been advancing positive change everywhere she goes. She is an inspiring historical first in so many ways. First member of her family to attend college, first African mayor, and actually the second woman mayor of San Antonio, which was the first Black woman mayor of a city with greater than 1 million people at that time. And she's now the first female president of Rust College in Holly Springs, Mississippi. We'll hear more about other firsts that she's implemented in her various roles, all of which have been designed to improve communities and the lives of the inhabitants. So, Dr. Taylor, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Rachel. Hello, everyone. Excited to be here.
Try to hide myself. Actually, I think I can do this with you. I'm going to spotlight your video. Maybe that will work. There we go. Okay, Dr. Taylor, or perhaps I should say President Taylor, congratulations on your new position.
Thank you.
Most of us really can only imagine how hard it must be to work at a higher educational institution during this pandemic, nevertheless to take one over with so many current and unknown health and economic issues. And I want to return back to kind of how you're doing there and some of your plans, but if you don't mind, I'd like to start with a little bit of background on who is Rust College and historically Black colleges and universities. So if you could just tell us a little bit about Rust College and the community that you serve, and the community there, and everything from students, staff, faculty, and the local community.
Okay, great. Well, thanks again for having me. Bring you greetings from Rust College, located here in Holly Springs, Mississippi, which just to give you a little reference point geographically, Holly Springs is in North Mississippi, and we're actually in the Memphis metropolitan area. So if you fly into the Memphis airport, it'll take you about 35 minutes to get to Rust College. Rust College was founded in 1866. It was one of those schools that was created to educate the freed slaves. Actually, the Freedmen's Aid Society of the Methodist Episcopal Church was responsible for the creation of Rust College through missionaries from the North. They connected with a local church here called Asbury Methodist Episcopal Church. And they started out providing education for students of all ages because, as we all know, slaves had been denied the opportunity to have any education. But then by 1870, it had become an official university. At that time, it was actually named Shaw University. For those of you who may know a little bit about HBCUs, that name sounds familiar because there actually is an HBCU named Shaw in Raleigh, North Carolina. So by 1892, the name of Rust was changed to Rust to honor a gentleman who led the Freedmen's Aid Society in Cincinnati. So since that time, Rust has persisted in providing education for those who may not have lots of opportunities, and has graduated over 5,000 from the college department, because originally it had a kind of a elementary and high school. So the graduates have gone on to, we have many graduates that have become bishops in the United Methodist Church and other denominations, school teachers, administrators, college presidents. The last president was an alum of Rust, and business and government leaders. So it's a small liberal arts college here. Holly Springs is a community of less than 10,000 people. So you could refer to it as a college town. Our most famous alum from Russ was Ida B. Wells Barnett, who you may have recently learned about because she was awarded the Pulitzer posthumously just a couple of months ago. But she was an activist, a suffragist, one of the founders of the NAACP. And one of our most famous instructors here was Hiram Revels, who if you remember your early American history or Civil War period, he was the first Black in the US Senate during Reconstruction. So that's a little snapshot of Russ.
Great, thank you. Now, when we chatted last week, I asked you kind of like, what's it like in Mississippi? And you had noted that, and I asked you, where do the students come from? And typically you'd said northern Mississippi, a bit from the Memphis metro area, but then you said there was also a group from Chicago.
Yes.
And you said that really prompted you to think about, why is that connection, and how does it relate to the story of the Great Northern Migration and your own personal family story?
Well, I've always been really fascinated by the Great Migration story because the impact it's had on my personal life and my trajectory. My parents were from Wilmington, North Carolina, and about 3 days after high school graduation, my mom got on a bus to New York City because she was seeking better opportunities. Her mother was a maid, and she didn't want to be a maid. She wanted to do something else, but no one in the family talked about actually sending her to college. She finished high school, and so she thought there'd be more opportunities for her in New York. Well, there were probably about 6 million Americans who had stories similar. And it's interesting when you look back at the migration patterns. There's a great, wonderful book, if you have not read it, a book written by Isabel Wilkerson about 10 years ago called The Warmth of Other Suns. And it gives in-depth stories, both the demographics and the statistics, as well as some personal stories about the migration patterns. And so North Carolina to New York was typical, but also very typical was Mississippi to Chicago. So there are lots of folks who live in Chicago now who have Mississippi roots. And I was very interested to discover that we have a fair number of students at Russ that have come from Chicago. The numbers, I don't have data on long-term, but I got some numbers just from the last few years. In 2017, we had 62 students from Chicago, and that's a student body out of a student body of only about 800. So that's a fair number of students coming from Chicago. Last year, it was down to about 35. So I guess it's been up and down, but there are definitely a lot of links and connections. And it's just interesting to think about those historical connections and the fact that folks in Chicago still feel connected to the Russ legacy. We have a very active alumni club for Russ College in Chicago, and they are part of the reason why we still have a strong pipeline of students coming from that part of the country.
Great, thank you. So now you're up, you were born up in New York, right, and raised in Queens.
Yeah.
Jumping a little bit forward to Yale, you weren't even thinking of applying at the time. Is that correct? And can you tell us about how you came about to matriculate there, and maybe a little about your mother's secret dream?
Okay, so yeah, my parents didn't go to college, but I went to public schools in New York, in Queens. And, I did well in school, and so I was definitely on the college track. And since I was in kind of the more competitive classes, most of the students were looking at very competitive schools. So I was as well. So I had a list that included several Ivy League schools. My top choice by 11th grade was Wesleyan in Middletown, Connecticut. And Yale was not on my list of places I was going to apply. I was applying to 10 or 12 schools. But my mom, and also I would say I was not familiar with HBCUs. So at that point, I just had not had exposure or education. So I was not focused on applying to HBCUs. But my mom insisted that I apply to Yale. She was very focused, and I had a lot of excuses on why. I don't know why. Back then you used to get the catalog. You couldn't go online and look up anything. You just used to get these catalogs, and I had, bags and bags of catalogs in my room, in the closet, and under the bed. And my mom just insisted that I apply to Yale. I don't know why the catalog had not appealed to me. So I finally gave in and applied, and only after, so at that point I still wanted to go to Wesleyan. When I went to visit Wesleyan, I absolutely hated it. I don't know, I think it was a cloudy day, but I just hated Wesleyan. So it was off the list. I was not planning to visit Yale, but I got a call from a young lady who actually had graduated from high school, and she was a Yale. She was finishing her freshman year, and she convinced me to come visit Yale for a minority, weekend, a weekend designated towards minority applicants. So I went and I absolutely loved it, fell in love, decided to attend. Only after I had decided to attend, we had determined that the financial aid would work out so that I could attend, did my mother reveal to me that when she graduated from that segregated high school in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1963, the valedictorian from her class went to Yale. And ever since then, she had a secret dream that she would send her child to Yale. She never told me this. And, I was 18 and I just said, okay, Mom. But years later, I said, what was really the possibility of the chances that, some young Black guy from Wilmington, North Carolina that attended segregated high school really went to Yale in 1963. And so after she died, she died in 2018. And I dug up her high school yearbook and I found the name of the valedictorian and I looked him up and I confirmed that yes, he was graduated from Yale in 1967. He left Wilmington and headed off to Yale as a result of the support and urging that he received from the counselors at that segregated high school who saw extreme talent in him. So I told him, I went to Yale because you went to Yale. So I always share that with people to say, you never know how your life and what you do in your work will inspire someone else who you may not even know is watching.
Yeah. And you said when you reached out to him, he knew who you were.
He knew who I was because he still subscribed to the Black newspaper called the Wilmington Journal. So, going back to the migration story, so these African Americans would leave their home communities and go to these big cities, New York, Chicago, but then in order to still stay connected with what's going on back home, he would get the Wilmington newspaper, Black newspaper, and my grandmother, who was still in Wilmington, she had put an article in there about what I was doing in San Antonio in politics. And so when I called him, he said, "Oh, you're the mayor."
I love that connection and that story. And we're going to get to your time as mayor a little bit, but let's finish up at Yale a little bit. And I don't mean to change the mood of this, but you did say your time at Yale was not particularly welcoming, and that you felt like a fish out of water. And I bet if I could see the video, there'd be a lot of people here nodding their heads, no matter what your background was. I was there crossing over the time with you, and there were a lot of times I had no idea. I had never heard of some of these suburban towns outside of New York City. And I was from the East Coast, so it was a different world. But you said really, other than finding a community of other Black students, you didn't really feel like the university was, or anybody was really looking out for your best interests. And that when it was time to graduate, you didn't really know what to do. So what did you do, and how did you kind of forge your career path from there?
So, at Yale, I was really excited for the intellectual exploration. I was kind of a little history buff, and I was excited that I could major in American studies, and the intellectual experience was great. I didn't make any connections with any of the faculty. No one took any interest in me, and I didn't know how to connect with them. And the career services was really focused around folks who were, I guess, set on a specific kind of corporate track. And then lots of students knew that they were going to med school or grad school, and that wasn't something I thought I was doing it was a big deal just for me to get a BA. I had no intentions to further my education. So I landed at home, back in Queens, in my bedroom. I grew up in there, the little brick house in Queens and Cambria Heights. And on the following Sunday after graduation, I just got the New York Times and turned to the classified section to look for a job, because all I had been told was you go to college and then you get a good job, but I really didn't know how those dots connected. And no one at Yale had really pushed me to think about it or helped me to think about connections that would help me with the next step. So I floundered through a series of administrative assistant jobs at corporations in New York, a couple of ad agencies, before I decided that I needed to go back to school and focus on something specific that would lead to a career. And so that's when I ended up uh, applying and being accepted to University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill to study urban planning. And getting back to that migration theme, what was interesting in New York City at that time in the 90s, a lot of people my age in their mid-20s were really looking to leave New York and go to Charlotte, Washington, D.C., or Atlanta. And so I was, kind of the reverse migration. So I was looking to go to one of those cities. It just so happened that UNC Charlotte did not have a planning program, so I landed at Chapel Hill, which ended up being one of the best planning programs in the country. I just didn't know. So yeah, so then that's where I really began to be focused on kind of my calling, which I describe as connecting people to opportunity. At that time, I was focused on affordable housing, neighborhood revitalization, and community development. That's really what the program prepared me, the fields the program prepared me to work in.
And you, in fact, had an internship in San Antonio, right? Is that how you came to know?
Yes, I landed in San Antonio through an internship with an organization that's now defunct. It was called, speaking of nonprofits, it was called the National Congress for Community and Economic Development. It was a national nonprofit organization that focused on lobbying the federal government for CDBG funds and other dollars to support grassroots community development efforts. And they had a program where they would pay a stipend for a graduate student to work with a grassroots CDC. And so I was assigned to work with the San Antonio Affordable Housing Association. And that's how I ended up in San Antonio. But then I ended up meeting my husband, who is a native. So that's why what was supposed to be 10 weeks turned into 22 years.
And so how did you, you moved from, working on housing stuff into city council, which was your first sort of elected political position?
Right. So first, I was a city employee. When my dream job, when I first landed out of graduate school was I thought I was going to work for some big sophisticated nonprofit that was putting lots of units on the ground, for struggling families. But I found that the nonprofit universe there wasn't quite as sophisticated as I had expected, even though I had worked with them for a summer. But in any case, so I ended up working for the city of San Antonio on revitalization initiatives. I was quickly had like a rude awakening in that at that time, late 90s, in that part of the country, I just felt like there was not a commitment to urban revitalization as I, had envisioned, that people really felt that when you make it, you move to the suburbs. And that was the natural cycle of things. And why should we invest in making neighborhoods better? Because if people would become better, then they would move to places that were better. That was kind of the cycle. There was not a lot of support for, the types of investments that I felt were needed in neighborhoods to create places where people thrive. So after becoming a little frustrated, I left employment with the city, and then I actually worked at a nonprofit that provided affordable housing. It was called Merced Housing Texas. It was a Catholic-sponsored agency. And I was responsible for not so much the housing side, but actually the social services side. So at the apartment communities that serve low-income families, we actually had an array of social services to support them in, whatever their personal goals were, whether it be financial, educational, health-wise. And it was through that experience of working closely with residents that really I realized that while affordable housing was important, that investing in education and personal growth and development would, by far, would far surpass investments in housing as far as impact on communities. So I kind of floundered in trying to figure out, well, how can I, get in on that action? So I got involved with several nonprofits and, on boards, but then some folks approached me and asked me to consider running for city council, which I thought was the craziest idea ever. I was like, I am not the PC person to say what people want to hear. I didn't envision myself as a politician. But then I said, well, you know, I had been thinking and praying for a while about how I could make a greater impact on communities and on individuals. And I thought maybe running for office might be the way to do it. So I threw my hat in the ring and I ran for city council and I ended up winning. And I won my first election to city council in a runoff, and I beat my opponent by 54 votes. So I know that every single vote counts. I know that from experience.
There we go. And I believe it's even, I'm down in Houston, Texas today, and I just heard some commercials about get out there and vote, because it's some primaries, I think. So local elections are important, obviously. You describe yourself as kind of reluctant politician, but you and we don't have to get into some of the ugly stories, and it doesn't take much. I can't even imagine the fortitude it would take to do that, to be in office. But you really used your time while you were there to implement a lot of firsts and some really interesting legacies, you know, starting with which pay for serving for the city council and the mayor's office. Tell us a little bit about that and maybe some of your other legacies you left there that you're really proud of.
Well, as a city council member, I was really effective in bringing attention and resources to the east side of San Antonio, which was kind of the historically Black side of town. You know, back during segregation, that was the area where Blacks could specifically buy property, because we were precluded from buying, you know, homes in other areas of San Antonio. So in most other areas, there was also a Black pocket on the west side, but that's another San Antonio story for another day. But so the Black council member had always come from the east side, and those neighborhoods had been severely neglected. And so I was able to start an east side revitalization project that eventually ended up bringing a fair amount of resources, city resources for basic services. But then also we were able to work with other community partners to eventually bring about $50 million in federal resources from HUD to redo the public housing in the area, and from the U.S. Department of Education in partnership with the local chapter of the United Way to create some new educational programs. So many of those projects are still unfolding. You know, it's really encouraging to drive down streets and see new investments of parks and new housing. It's also kind of sparked an interest in some of the areas where there's more historic housing. And so it's kind of a double-edged sword, because some folks might complain about gentrification in certain pockets there. But really, you know, I think that was in order to stop the decline, that you wanted to have people come in and make investments. And I think ultimately that will be positive for that neighborhood. So 5 years as council member, and then unexpectedly ended up becoming mayor when the mayor at the time was tapped by President Obama to lead HUD. And our city charter said the mayor had to be selected from the council by the council. And so I was selected to serve in that role. I think partly because some people felt like, you know, it's a competitive environment. You've got, you know, 10 folks, somebody's going to run for mayor in a year. There was a year left on the previous mayor's term. And so no one really wanted to give anyone the competitive advantage of having a year's experience as mayor before an election. And so I think there was a high degree of doubt and skepticism that a Black person could win a citywide election in San Antonio. So why not let the Black girl sit in the seat for a year, and, you know, and then we'll elect a mayor in a year. But much to their surprise, within a year, I actually did win the election. So then I ended up serving as mayor for 3 years.
Right. Now, when you also reluctantly, I gather, you know, was going to run for the second term, official term, and there had been people circulating, professional politicians around. So at the end of the day, it didn't work out. But you did a lot of good work there. And you said after you finished your term as mayor, it was actually challenging to find a job in San Antonio, which is amazing. I always think it's sort of your ticket's written, you can do whatever you like, and you've had to kind of rethink it and pivot your career a little bit. So then what did you end up doing?
Yeah, I found that, you know, once you kind of run for office, sometimes you get labeled as a politician. So people kept asking me what else I was going to run for, but I never really had any intention of running for anything, just kind of fell into it. felt that that was God's plan at that time for me. So when I ended up losing in 2017, I was like, oh, what am I going to do next? I hadn't wanted to run past 2019. My plan was to, stay in office for 2017 to 19 term and then find a job, because I had a daughter who I was anticipating having to pay for her to go to college. So public service doesn't pay a lot. And I was looking forward to, being able to secure employment, where I could put away a few more coins for her college education. Because if she had gotten into Yale, I was like, oh my God, how would I pay for that? But anyway, the path was not clear at first. So it kind of took some soul searching, and I applied for some jobs that frankly, I probably wouldn't have been happy if I had gotten them, but I was trying to be practical. But I'm a person of faith. And so I really believe that there was another plan for me. So the one thing that did work out, well, at that time I had already been serving on the board of another HBCU called Houston Tillotson. It's a small Black college in Austin. And I found the president there to be very inspiring. And she had had a career change later in life. And she told me about this program at University of Pennsylvania where she was able to get a doctor of education in a 2-year time frame. So I became really interested in wanting to work more intensely in that HBCU space, because during the time that I had learned about HBCUs, I really felt that they had a significant impact on the Black community, on Black Americans, on social and upward mobility, and also creating leadership for Black America. And so I ended up applying to Penn, like literally about, I went on the website about 2 weeks before the application was due for this doctoral program. And I ended up applying and getting in. And so I did that program, which was a 2-year program where you did dissertation and coursework simultaneously. And I just recently completed it. In fact, about 3 days ago, I got the final okay that first I had a couple of tables that were outside of the 1-inch margin on my dissertation. And do that a couple of times. I had the list of tables in the wrong place, but I finally got the okay that everything is everything. And my advisor has signed off on everything. So with the program at Penn. So I entered the program with an intense focus on learning as much as I could about higher education in general, but about HBCUs specifically, because I knew I wanted to use my talents and skills in that space. And here I am.
And your dissertation thesis was specifically about studying the role of board governance and accreditation at HBCUs. And you went around and visited and looked at a bunch of those. And curious to know how you came to that topic, kind of what you learned, and how is that going to affect you now that you're sort of on the other side of the governance line and you're going to have to manage a board?
Yes. So I came to that because, I kind of had become like a little bit of a governance nerd through my work, dating back to my work as an urban planner, which I still kind of call myself an urban planner. But, the program at Carolina was very focused on the role of CDCs in relation to neighborhood revitalization. So I always saw CDCs as agents of change, and for that reason had gotten interested in governance of those organizations, governance of nonprofits. And then I ended up, in municipal governance. And so had always had an interest in, how can governing bodies be more effective? How do they lead to more effective organizations? So a lot of the research and things that have been written about HBCUs centered on the role of the president, and how the presidents impact the institutions, but I felt like there had not been enough discussion about the roles of the boards of trustees. And also there was a lot of static about, accrediting agencies and whether or not there's disparate treatment of HBCUs. The UNCF did a white paper last year about that in relation to 1B accreditors, where the majority of HBCUs use. So I kind of wanted to get into that conversation. So I looked at some schools that had been on or probation or warning status with the accrediting agency. And then I talked with the boards and presidents about how they moved off that status back into the good graces of the accreditor. So I kind of learned a lot. I definitely learned that the boards have an important role to play. They don't always step up to what's needed for them. Some of that is related to history. A lot of HBCUs were founded by religious organizations, and their charters and bylaws require representation from those religious organizations on the boards. And I don't know that the religious organizations are always as thoughtful as they can be in designating who serves on the board, ensuring that the institutions have the talent and skill sets that are needed in order to guide institutions through, you know, the ever-changing landscape of higher education. So, and then also the boards, I think, need to pay more attention definitely to the accrediting side, though, you know, you've got, as you mentioned, that fine line between governance and management. It's really up to the presidents and the staff to be able to dot all the I's and cross the T's in relation to, but you've got to have trustees who are strategic and keeping their eye on the ball in relation to those issues. So it was kind of a fun study, and you're right, I find myself now I'm on the other side. And so I'm just learning the folks who are on the board here at Russ. You know, it's been a little awkward with COVID. I've only actually met one of them in person. We've had all our meetings via Zoom. So I'm sure we'll develop a strong relationship over time, but yeah, I did learn a lot through that study.
Good. Well, it's going to be interesting to see how you draw upon that research and knowledge as you go forward. So yeah, let's turn back to where you are right now. I mean, you've been there since June. You said you're clearly in your office, which is which is great, I guess. And you said you've actually been looking to talk with every single person who works at Russ, from the custodian to faculty to everyone. How's that going so far? What are you learning? Kind of what are your plans?
I finally completed that. It was important.
Awesome.
Small school with a little more than 100 employees, I think about 130. So I have spoken with every employee, from custodians to faculty, you know, every staffer here. And what's been fascinating is that there are a lot of people here who graduated from Rust. Again, the urban planner in me is kind of very interested in the place and space that we're situated in. It was very compelling hearing stories from there's an older woman here who works as an accountant, and she, you know, she shared with me some stories about being a young person, cleaning houses. You know, she said someone gave her a toothbrush and told her to get on her knees and, you know, scrub the baseboards. And she was very determined that that was not how she was going to spend her life. And so she's been working here over 30 years. But from some of the older employees, I have heard that Russ College was the only place where Blacks could work in this area if they wanted to have a professional job. Every other job in this part of the country at that time, you know, 30 or 40 years ago, was either factory work or cleaning houses. So just thinking about the impact that Russ has had on people's lives, just from that perspective, for those employees to be able to have a professional job that then provided stability for their families, for their kids to then have more options, you know, really is transformative. So I've been learning some of that history from meeting with all the employees. I haven't, you know, it's summertime and students aren't here on the campus, so it's kind of weird because I haven't had the chance to have a lot of student interaction. I've had some limited interaction with students who have wandered through the campus and come by to say hello. So that's kind of the unknown. Looking forward to meeting the students when we do welcome them back to campus. But, you know, I've learned a lot about the history of the institution, but also needs for us going forward into the future. There are some areas where we need modernization. And I think one that was underscored was sparked by the pandemic, when students had to leave and instruction had to continue remotely, then that really was a spark for some of maybe the faculty who've been a little lagging on embracing technology for instruction, then they had to do it. And so in a way, that's a little bit of a silver lining with that situation.
Good. Well, I'm sure you're going to be very busy getting everybody ready. And so before we turn to some questions, I just would like to, if you may, just indulge me for a minute to give everyone on the call a little bit more information about HBCUs generally. I mean, a lot of the people I saw somebody was a class of Russ 72, so I'll have to turn back to that. So you've got your own followers there. And for those of us in the Northeast who don't know a lot about HBCUs, I just wanted to add that I understand there are about 107 officially recognized, and they're actually separately ranked in the U.S. News and World Report, whether you love or hate the U.S. News, but they're, people can find them. They're mostly in the South. And I was doing some digging around and saw that some remarks from U.S. Congresswoman Alma Adams from North Carolina. In her remarks supporting funding for the HBCUs under the Future Act, which has since passed both the House and the Senate, and I think it's in a deliberation stage. And they gave some really interesting graphics. And you had said how important HBCUs were for kind of providing Black leaders in many areas of society. So some of the details, some of the statistics are HBCUs produce 27% of all African-American STEM graduates, 40% of all African-American engineers, 50% of all African-American lawyers, 50% of all African-American public school teachers, 80% of all African-American judges, and all of this despite only educating roughly 10% of all African-American college students.
Yes.
That's pretty amazing.
Speaks volumes.
It does.
It begs so many questions about higher ed in general. I mean, are we adequately, or I mean, the word adequate, it probably isn't even the right word, but are we sufficiently serving African Americans who attend, you know, predominantly white institutions? If those students are not able to attain and achieve those, you know, same job classifications, vocations, and careers, then, you know, what's going on in the other higher ed spaces? Why is it that, you know, HBCUs are the ones that are creating the pipeline for these types of careers that provide stability and fulfillment for, you know, for people and their families?
Okay, this ties into our last question before we take questions from the audience. And on that vein, you know, what is it about HBCUs, you think, that makes them special, unique, important, worthy of investment? And what is your take? Like, what do you think some like places like Yale and other organizations could learn from it?
Well, I think that HBCUs are spaces and places where Black Americans are expected to strive for excellence. And that, you know, Blacks, we don't always experience that in every other aspect of society. I'll never forget being home for like a Christmas holiday in Queens, and I went to the movie theater in Flushing, and I had on, you know, a Yale baseball jacket with the white leather sleeves, and it says Yale on the back. And I remember a group of young girls who were white, they walked by me and they just laughed and they were like, yeah, right, like she went to Yale. And, you know, I just think people don't always expect the most of us. And HBCU is a space where everyone is expecting and looking for excellence from students, and looking to fill in the gaps where students don't have the support at home for them to thrive, that they will receive that nurture, you know, on the campus at HBCUs, that people can grow and explore without the added burden of, quote unquote, representing the race or having to educate others about, you know, what it means to be Black. So, and for some families, HBCUs means a legacy that's passed down. My family was not one of those families, but there are many families, especially more so in the South, where, you know, had closer access to HBCUs, where parents and grandparents have attended these institutions. Rachel, I told you that I switched computers right before the call.
Yes.
While you switch to questions, I'm going to grab my power cord and make sure that I don't get
Okay. All right, go ahead. So I noticed I saw some people with, okay, great. I was going to say, I didn't get through the chats and some people had raised their hands, but let's go with the Q&A. Our first is from someone on our board, Allison Gardy, and she asks, what can we do to keep building momentum for positive social change in this country? Why not? We're going to ask you since you've done a lot of leadership roles. Specifically, what role has your university, as Russ College, played in the local race relationships in Mississippi? And do you sense a greater openness between Black and white communities in rewriting local history, untelling some of these Black stories and perspectives, and improving present day relations? And I think a lot of this is, what do you think the role is of a place like Rust and the communities down there in the larger discussions that are going on in the country?
Well, I certainly think, and I'm sorry, I've just changed my position here. I certainly think that HBCUs have a great role to play in those types of conversations, just because they, some of the things that we just talked about as far as providing young people the opportunity to understand themselves, their history, and then to envision leadership roles for social justice. I had mentioned that Ida B. Wells was a graduate of this institution, and what a incredible inspiration she serves for people who are unfortunately dealing with some of the same type of issues that she was dealing with 100 years ago. I think there are probably many different spaces and places where people can kind of enter the conversation. Sometimes I get a little frustrated with some of the narratives because I don't think it broadens the discussion on the many different ways that people can make a difference in different areas of society. Of course, it's important for elected officials and policymakers to make investments in certain areas, but I think we need to be looking to local leadership and local institutions and thinking about how we can nurture maybe smaller institutions that have a great impact on communities as well.
Great, thank you. Another question has to do with kind of what advice and perspective for students. Looking back at Yale, what do you wish you had known then? What advice might you have to first-gen students? That's what now, I don't think back then we used that term so much, but that's how people are self-identifying. There's more support, clearly not as much as we'd like to have. So assuming that we've got some students on the call and this is being recorded and we've got being co-sponsored by First Gen Yale, who works with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of first-gen students, what can you tell them?
Well, let's see, what do I wish that when I was at Yale that I had felt more comfortable maybe asking for reaching out to the faculty and staff and kind of expanding beyond the African American community at Yale, because I think I missed a lot of opportunities, just to kind of know how different people experience life and what their aspirations might be and connections that I could have made for the future. I don't know how it could have been different for someone like me coming from the community that I grew up in. Maybe there could have been more of an effort to encourage, kind of cross-pollination between different groups. I don't know either if the classroom experience could have maybe pushed that a little more, or other activities outside of the classroom as well. So.
Thank you. All right, so we have a comment from someone who says, congratulations on your career, and your comments about Yale not really preparing you for a career. This person felt the same way, class of 76, and said that you've got an ally at Morehouse, I gather David Thomas is Yale class of 78, and said, have you thought of any opportunities to collaborate, maybe create some interesting links between some of these HBCUs and Yale, or doing something interesting and different together?
I would love to be able to collaborate. I have to find the right probably person or at Yale that'd be interested in connecting, but I'm hoping that that could be something that could be explored for the future, since many institutions are taking a stronger interest in, how they can support social justice and opportunities for Blacks in America. I know that Yale is similarly situated.
Great. Let's see, we have time for a few more questions, and we're going to let Dr. Taylor go. She's got a busy schedule. If there are any other last minute questions, any other alums from Rust or from Yale who wish to say anything, you could go ahead and type it into the chat or the Q&A. Dr. Thomas, I think we just mentioned that about from Morehouse. And you are preparing to have everyone on campus, is that correct? And it's a dormitory style, correct?
Yes. We are preparing cautiously to welcome students back to campus, just because we don't want them to interrupt, their education. We feel like some of the students that we serve have less options for, maybe meaningful experiences that they could do at this time. So we want them to be able to continue their education. So we have a whole host of, policies and procedures that will be in place in order to try and protect to the extent that we can from COVID, social distancing, different formats for instruction, with more online instruction available, less occupancy of the dorms. I think the thing that we are concerned about, a big part beyond the academic experience, is the student experience and the connections that students have, and we won't be able to have large gatherings. So we're hoping that we'll be able to get creative and still making meaningful connections between students through virtual means and smaller group settings.
Wonderful. And we're just going to wrapping up here because I want to close out before the end of the hour. Getting a lot of congratulations and thank you for your leadership and your thoughtfulness and your kindness and what you've been doing. And this is a bit of a personal question, but I know it's been something central to your life, is what is the role of faith that's been sustaining? You mentioned a couple of times that you felt like you were called to something else, and that kind of helped you keep going and maybe continue to find a pathway. And just maybe a little say about that, because
yes, faith plays a big role in my life and the things that I've done. I've been taught from an early age that to whom much is given, much is required. And so I have so many blessings. And so I've always sought to, determine how could I give back in ways that can positively impact others, maybe folks who didn't have some of the same opportunities. And so at critical junctures, I have felt that, paths and opportunities have been presented to me, or when I felt some tension about, how to move forward, that God has sent a messenger to share. And I'll just give one quick story on that note. You mentioned, Rachel, that I served the 1 year as mayor, but I was not planning to run to serve another term, because really I don't like the running side, that it can get real ugly, and I just really didn't want to run. So I had been saying, I want to be mayor, but I don't want to run for mayor. And then opportunity was available for me to be appointed. So I felt, well, let me just do that and go sit down. Well, during that first year that I was mayor, I had the opportunity for a meeting with Dr. Condoleezza Rice, who was serving as a consultant for a firm that was looking to do business with San Antonio. So I was just a groupie, just so excited I got to be in a room with Dr. Rice. So Dr. Rice, she came with a couple of her associates, and I had a couple of city staffers there. And then she was congratulating me on being mayor and my achievements. And then she said, well, I understand that you're not planning to run for mayor. And I said, no, Dr. Rice, I'm not. And she looked at the other people in the room and she said, excuse me, I think we need a little girl talk. And she dismissed the other people who were in the room. And then here I am sitting one-on-one with Dr. Condoleezza Rice, about to have a heart attack. And says, so tell me why it is that you're not planning to run for mayor. And I said, well, I always said I want to be the mayor and I didn't want to run, and I got just what I asked for, and I felt that I should just be content and move forward. And she looked at me and she said, did you ever think that maybe God needed to put you in the position so that you could see what possibilities were and what you could possibly do so that you would know that you needed to run for this position. And I was flabbergasted.
Wow.
I was just kind of like, well, no, I never thought of it that way. And that was the beginning of me changing my thinking about the possibility of running. I still dragged my feet for several months after that, but I always kind of credit Dr. Rice with, oh my God, here's someone that I admire so much who I just happened to be in a room with. And she spoke to me about, you know, changing my thinking of what the possibilities were. So I've had quite a few moments like that in my life, and I'm grateful.
Good. Well, that's a great story. Thank you for sharing. That really shows not only your faith, but you know, your openness and being prepared for things and kind of going where the important work leads you. So thank you again, Dr. Taylor. Congratulations and best of luck. We hope to check in with you maybe in a year and see how things are going there, and maybe we can come up with some interesting collaborations. But and if we ever get back in person, we're going to try to open some more YANA chapters down here in the South.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity, and I just ask that for folks who are unfamiliar with the HBCUs in general and Russ College specifically, that you would check us out at russcollege.edu, and that you would consider supporting Russ specifically. But if not Russ, then another HBCU that's doing the same type of work that is helping to shape our society and create leaders, continues to help create leaders for the future. The work of our HBCUs is still relevant.
Thank you very much. We'll take that all to heart. Best of luck. Thank you, everyone. This will be recorded, video and audio, so we'll be able to share it in a couple different formats. Have a terrific rest of your day, and Dr. Taylor, good luck with the rest of the summer and the beginning of the school year.
Okay, thanks everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.